More leaks, more evidence, more pressure on Saudi Arabia over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Turkey has another audio recording that contradicts the kingdom's claims the journalist's death was not premeditated. The Saudi narrative changes almost daily. Is there more to come from Turkey? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Laura Kyle. Welcome to the programme. Saudi Arabia has given numerous versions of what happened to journalist Jamal Khashoggi at its consulate in Istanbul. It's always maintained Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman knew nothing about the murder plot and says it'll seek the death penalty for 5 Saudi suspects. But Turkey says it has new information that differs completely from Riyadh's latest narrative. The Turkish newspaper Hurriyet says leaked audio has Khashoggi's killings discussing how he would die before he even entered the consulate. Meanwhile, Muslims around the world have been remembering Khashoggi with funeral prayers held in absentia in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Indonesia, the UK and the US. It's now more than 6 weeks since the Washington Post columnist was murdered. Turkey maintains the orders came from the highest level of the Saudi royal court, but that's again been denied.
His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has nothing to do with this issue. In fact, the National Security Advisor in the US said this. This was a rogue operation. We have a better sense of what happened. This was individuals exceeding their authority and going beyond their mandate, and these individuals made a tremendous mistake, and for this mistake they will pay a price.
Well, let's turn now to our panel discussion. And joining us here in Doha, Saad Djebbar, international lawyer and political commentator. In Istanbul, Matthew Bryza, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former US diplomat. And via Skype from Newark in New Jersey, Sahar Aziz, professor of law at Rutgers University and director of the Centre on Security, Race and Civil Rights. A very warm welcome to all of you here to Inside Story. Matthew, if I can start with you. Turkey has wasted no time, hasn't it, discrediting Saudi's latest version of events with this leak of the new audio recording. Just give us an idea of how it differs to the Saudi narrative.
It's diametrically opposed in as much as the Saudi narrative is that there had been an altercation inside the consulate, that that Mr. Khashoggi was going to be taken back to Saudi Arabia. He resisted. He was given an injection of a sedative. He got too much and he passed away, and then they dismembered his body. The Turkish account is totally different. The Turkish account is that this was a premeditated murder, that the team that was formed, well, as you were just saying, was talking about killing Mr. Khashoggi the day before, and that the team was equipped with somebody who was a forensics expert, who had a bone saw, who was ready to dismember the victim's body, and that in the days before the murder, the members of the team were actually scouting locations in forests around and inside Istanbul to dispose of the body. So from the Turkish perspective, this is absolutely a premeditated crime. Now, neither President Erdogan nor the American side have implicated Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. But the way President Erdogan has handled this by dealing with the King Salman directly, and then leaking out all this credible information that talks about premeditation is an implicit way to say President Erdogan and Turkey are not being fooled about where responsibility ultimately lies.
Saad, do you think that the Saudis had hoped to draw a line under this by announcing their version of events on Thursday and indeed the death penalty for 5 Saudi suspects? And do you think that this new audio dashes those hopes?
Well, the Saudis' narrative should be completely discounted. They can't be judge and jury in their own crime. Therefore, we should not adopt that rationale or logic. Far from that, an international inquiry and prosecution should be really resorted to for the sake of knowing the exact truth. We know who committed the crime. We know the identity of those who committed it. We know that in the Saudi political system, nothing moves, even a fly in the sky, without the approval of the crown prince or the king. In this case, is the crown prince, is the mover and shaker. Therefore, there is nothing credible more than having an international inquiry, independent inquiry, and an international prosecution.
And I certainly
of the case.
want to come back to that idea of an international inquiry later in the programme. For the moment, I just want to get an idea from you, Saad, how much pressure this particular new audio might be putting on Saudi now?
Well, without the international pressure, without the international community and the media and non-governmental organizations, the Saudis lived in denial, and they were accepting the truth by installment, drip by drip. That's why I would stress the point that we should not take any notice what the Saudis have said, because they are claiming jurisdiction, whereas they have violated, or they were in gross violation of international law, namely the Vienna Convention on Sovereign Immunity and Diplomatic Immunity. They have breached, or they were in gross violation of all of the Turkish laws and all other international laws. That's why we should not in any way or any manner accept their narrative or listen to them. They have to accept that the only way to, for them to avoid any further scrutiny is to accept they have acted as a terrorist state, as a rogue state.
Let's just
it is not rogue elements.
Get an idea of how we get the Saudis to reach that point. And Sahar, what do you make of the way the Turks are handling this so far? Drip-feeding the evidence, countering the Saudis every time it comes up with a new version of events. Is this the right way to go about this?
I think it's the only way to go about it. Presumably, they have attempted behind the scenes through diplomatic channels to seek a way to either do this through an international tribunal or through a Turkish court. But at this point, with the Saudis refusing to, initially the Saudis didn't even acknowledge that this was a murder. And they claimed that he had just disappeared and he had left the embassy. And it was only after revealing the evidence, slowly albeit, and with the pressure from the international press, that the Saudis were forced to have to admit, because the evidence was so clear, that he was murdered, although they're still denying that it was ordered by Mohammed bin Salman. I think from a geopolitical level, what Turkey is doing is quite brilliant, because the Saudis have been pressuring the Turks along with the Iranians. I think Turkey is #2 after Iran in terms of being a foe of Saudi Arabia's goal to be the hegemon in the region. And so they have been doing many things for the past few years to try to undermine Turkey. And I think Turkey is using this as an opportunity to tell Saudi Arabia, you are now in a weak spot, and we will not allow you to get away with this human rights violation. It's also very insulting to Turkey or any nation for them to have the audacity to commit such an atrocious human rights violation on Turkish soil.
Matthew, what should Turkey do with this new audio? We know in the past that they've allowed the US to listen to previous audio recordings that they had, France, the UK, Canada. Should this one equally be put out there, made public?
Well, it should certainly, I think, be shared with the same people that were able to listen to the initial tape. I mean, the head of the CIA, Gina Haspel. We still don't know if we still don't know if Secretary Pompeo actually listened to the original tape when he visited Ankara a few weeks ago. And I would recommend that the Turks share the tape with members of Congress. Key senators now are preparing stronger sanctions beyond those that were announced just the other day by the Trump administration in what I believe is an attempt by the Trump administration to placate world opinion, say we're on this, and let the whole issue fade away. So maybe not at this point sharing it publicly, maybe that wouldn't be the best thing, because it would look maybe too much like the Turks are grandstanding. But certainly let the U.S. officials hear it, and as well as prepare to submit it to whatever UN investigation that may happen.
OK, well, let's just take a look at what action the United States has taken this past week. On Thursday, it imposed economic sanctions on 17 Saudis it believes to be involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And a bipartisan group of senators has introduced legislation seeking to punish Saudi Arabia for the journalist's killing and for its role in the war in Yemen. Now, if that bill becomes law, weapons sales would be suspended and the US would stop refueling Saudi aircraft carrying out bombing raids on Yemen. But the bill has to get through Congress and could still face the veto of President Donald Trump. Republican Senator Bob Corker calls the sanctions a significant step, but does hope that more action will be taken.
I've asked for a high-level briefing with Mattis, Pompeo, and Gina Haspel to come in as soon as we get back to share with us what is happening with Saudi Arabia on both fronts, both Yemen and what is happening as it relates to the journalist who was assassinated, in my opinion, at the direction of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia.
Sahar, just tell us a little bit about the significance and the impact that these sanctions against these 17 Saudis have had, because they do reach up to some of the top aides of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
Well, the sanctions imposed so far are not commensurate with the seriousness of the series of crimes committed by the Saudis. The Saudis stay under international law, and this is not to be discussed because this is irrevocably the law, is responsible in terms of civil responsibility, in other words, compensation for the victims. But the Saudi government is responsible in terms of what happened, and without reaching to the highest level. Imagine if Mohammed bin Salman was the director of a company or an institution. The fact that that crime or crimes happened under his watch, if he knew, he would have resigned. If he didn't know, he would have resigned. In both circumstances, that guy shouldn't be there shaking hands or meeting with the international leaders. That's why the first preliminary step is for the world community led by the United States, which is the biggest democracy in the world, in terms of values with the United States, freedom of the press, protection of journalists, and other constitutional safeguards for journalists and other democratic values. They should never, ever appease Mohammed bin Salman. In the least, they should boycott him and they should not talk to him as a preliminary step. Then they should make it a condition that the Saudis, if they did not extradite those involved in the crime directly, and the suspects, including the Crown Prince, to an international panel of inquiry, an independent one, and an independent prosecution authority, we should not appease the Saudis. And it's very unfortunate to see that the National Security Advisor and Trump, they prematurely tried to appease the culprits or the suspects.
Sahar, do you think that that sort of action that Saad is talking about against the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman will ever be taken within the Trump administration?
Very unlikely, because from the United States perspective, domestically, for those of us who support human rights, both normatively and legally, is we have two challenges. One is President Trump himself, who has made it very clear through his rhetoric and through his actions and policies that he does not take human rights seriously and does not believe that that is something that should be seriously considered in international relations. The second is we have a significant industrial complex of a defense industry that makes billions of dollars selling arms to countries around the world. And those two factors are going to be pushing very hard on Congress not to pass these bills. And even if they end up passing, which I don't anticipate, they will very likely be vetoed, because Trump has made it clear that Mohammed bin Salman is his man in the region. And so the real challenge is, how can you pressure Trump to realize that Mohammed bin Salman is more of a liability than an asset, because Trump only thinks in terms of realpolitik and dollars and cents, and he disregards human rights, both domestically and internationally.
Matthew, do you agree with that? Do you think that there can be enough pressure, or do you think that there can be enough pressure to force this particular bill that they're proposing from both sides of the party lines to pass through both houses and indeed avoid a US veto?
I believe it is challenging, but I do believe it can happen. Look, the Trump administration already knows it's got to do something. So it has unilaterally already announced that it's cutting off the aerial refueling of the Saudi and Emirati aircraft conducting the war in Yemen, and that's one of the provisions in this bill. And you know, they understand, I think, how flimsy this explanation is, and how flimsy, in fact, the sanctions they implemented to date are. As Senator Rand Paul said of Kentucky yesterday, it's ridiculous that the U.S. is sanctioning people who are already accused of the crime and are sitting in prison. So I think the tide can turn. I think it remains to be seen, however, whether or not there could be a passage of the legislation in a veto-proof way. That would need to be 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. I think the jury is still out on whether such a high number can be pulled together, but I actually do believe it's possible.
It's been suggested in U.S. media, Matthew, that the White House might have hoped also to have drawn a line under this issue by announcing these sanctions against these 17 Saudi suspects. Do you think that was the hope from the U.S. State Department, from the White House?
Yeah, I definitely think that was the hope. And if you look at the language that is used in the sanctions, as well as what Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin said, it's language that doesn't say that these people who are sanctioned actually committed the murder. It says people who were involved with, people who were somehow associated with, maybe the planning of an operation, which plays right into the Saudi explanation that this was some sort of an interrogation and rendition gone badly. So I really feel the White House is doing all it can to protect bin Salman. One more point about that. I agree with my colleagues' comments about Trump administration's lack of respect for human rights, or President Trump's, not the administration, and the desire to sell arms. But I also think that, you know, Vision 2030 is something a lot of people want to see succeed. It's an additional element. I mean, a Saudi Arabia that's no longer so dependent only on hydrocarbons but has a more diversified economy is a more stable country. It's just that whole issue is overwhelmed by the possibility that the architect of that reform program could have ordered a murder.
Absolutely, absolutely. OK, Saad, let's move on to that international investigation that you mentioned earlier. The Turks are now saying that they want one. So why don't they just go ahead and call for one?
I think they should. They should firstly go to the Security Council because they have irrevocable evidence that Saudi officials came well equipped with means which were not available, wouldn't have been available except for a state, because they were carrying diplomatic passports, private jets, all the equipment to carry out this crime. And I would say series of crimes, because there was an attempt for rendition, kidnapping. Then after the murder, the parts of the body were outsourced to an outsider, which would fall within the jurisdiction of Turkey. Therefore, we have a conflict here of jurisdiction. And what happened is an affront to international law, the Vienna Convention and other international customary laws, diplomatic courtesies and so on. And plus, we know very well, pragmatically and practically, that the Saudis will never extradite those people to Turkey. Therefore, the way forward will be for the Security Council to take action under Chapter 7, a binding decision which will bind Saudi Arabia to extradite those who were directly involved in the crime. And secondly, any suspect, including the head of the state, who is the Crown Prince, and also to cooperate with the investigation before and during the trial. That's what happened in the Lockerbie case to Gaddafi.
I suppose the big question here, Sahar, is whether, just 1 second, let's just get to the point first of whether the Security Council would ever allow an international investigation to take place. Sahar, what do you think about that?
Again, we're going to run up against President Trump and his team at the UN, and they will veto it. It's clear from what Trump's rhetoric is. He wants bin Salman to stay because he is a benefit to Trump and, you know, his agenda. So I think that they are going to veto it. They may even be able to persuade others on the Security Council to veto it, because this case has broader implications if there is, in fact, accountability and justice, which is that there are many authoritarian regimes, some of whom are on the Security Council and many of whom are on the UN Human Rights Commission, that also persecute, if not outright kill, journalists. And so if this is set as a precedent, then many other authoritarian regimes who do not respect the freedom of the press and who arrange for their journalists to be assassinated, or at least are complicit in it, will find themselves susceptible to similar courts and similar trials or similar procedures. So I think what we're dealing with in many ways is much broader than just accountability for Saudi Arabia, but it includes U.S. Saudi Arabian relations and also international freedom of the press. And for that reason, I think what the international press has been doing has been monumental and very important. And but for the Washington Post, the New York Times, and many other international venues, but for their pressure in terms of bringing out the facts and reporting the facts to the public, I don't think we would have even gotten this far where we have these very minor sanctions, but it's better than we started.
Saad, if not at or through the Security Council, how else could an international investigation be instigated? Remember,
what happened to Khashoggi is the tip of the iceberg. There are gross violations of human rights in Saudi Arabia. There are hundreds of people who are rotting in prison without any really credible charge. And plus, what happened in Yemen by the same rationale led by the Crown Prince. Therefore, there is, we could say that there is crime against humanity because there is a methodological...
But who would investigate that? What body would investigate that?
The International Criminal Court, because if we could establish, and we could establish what happened in Yemen against civilians and against Saudis who are rotting in prison now, and what happened to Khashoggi, the blockade against Qatar itself, if Qatar were not vigilant in 2014, what happened to Khashoggi as a person would have happened to the Qatari people and Qatari leadership here. Therefore, this man is a very serious threat, not only to the region, but is a threat to Saudi Arabia as we know it.
Matthew, what would an international investigation achieve? I mean, say we had it, we found culpability, then what?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the implication or premise of your question that probably bin Salman, that wouldn't force him in itself out of his status as crown prince, because the Saudi government would simply not recognize that decision. But it would be a humiliation of the Saudi Arabian royal family, of the government, and of the country. And, at some point, domestic tensions inside Saudi Arabia matter. The crown prince is not very popular outside of his immediate circle. We all know about the arrests of members of the royal family and some of the biggest other business people in Saudi Arabia. So I think there are probably a lot of people out there who are hungry for revenge, and plenty of others, elder statesmen, who think that he's been reckless and gotten Saudi Arabia into some terrible situations already, with taking the Prime Minister of Lebanon hostage, the horrible war in Yemen, the world's biggest humanitarian catastrophe. He's behaving in a reckless way. So maybe that would be the straw that did break the camel's back. OK,
Sahar, just in the last minute we have, if pressure is maintained in whichever way or whichever form it takes, do you think the truth about Khashoggi's murder is ever going to be known?
I think if Turkey continues to reveal the tapes, and if it's willing to reveal it to journalists who can corroborate it, then the truth will be revealed. The question is whether those who are responsible for this crime, this universal international crime, will ever be held accountable.
OK, it's been a fascinating discussion. Many thanks to all of you for joining us here today on Inside Stories. Saad Djebbar in Doha, Matthew Bryza in Istanbul, and Sahar Aziz in Newark, the US. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And of course, always for further discussion, do go and visit our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Plus, you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.